The message came through at 11:47 on a Thursday morning, routed first through his assistant, then formatted into the standard project documentation chain, the way all correspondence was handled cleanly, professionally, without friction. Nathaniel Crane read it once. Dear Mr. Crane, please find attached the final deliverables package for the Alderman Civic Hall restoration project. Phase 2. All structural assessments, material sourcing documentation, and contractor handover files are enclosed. It has been a privilege contributing to this project. I wish your team continued success through to completion. Warm regards, Mara Voss, Principal Architect. Voss, Restoration Consulting. He set his phone face down on the desk, outside his office window. The city went about its business 41 floors below, construction cranes rotating slowly against a flat gray November sky. A river of traffic on the boulevard moving in the stop-start rhythm that never changed regardless of the hour. Nathaniel had watched that view for 6 years from this desk. It had never looked like anything other than what it was, a system. Operating. He pulled the Alderman project file and confirmed what the message implied. Phase 2, formally closed. Final invoice submitted. No outstanding deliverables. Everything was in order. He opened his calendar and removed 3 upcoming site meetings. Then he went back to work. He was 38 years old. He had built a company worth $4.2 billion, which meant that for most of the past decade, people had worked very hard to make sure he was never uncomfortable. There were people whose entire professional function was anticipating what Nathaniel Crane might need before he needed it. His assistant Petra, who had worked for him for 9 years and communicated almost exclusively in precise, emotionally neutral language that mirrored his own. His operations director, James Yu, could run 12 construction timelines simultaneously and never once asked Nathaniel how he was doing. A full floor of analysts, project managers, engineers, and legal staff who moved through Crane Infrastructure's offices with the quiet efficiency of a system that had been calibrated over years to Nathaniel's exact specifications. The specification, though no one had ever stated it plainly, was this: keep everything functional and nothing personal. It worked. Extraordinarily well, Nathaniel had grown up in a 2-bedroom apartment in the outer industrial district of the city. The son of a man who loved too loudly and too carelessly and had paid for it his entire life, lost business partnerships, lost friendships. A marriage that dissolved before Nathaniel was 10 because his father could never seem to understand that giving someone your full emotional availability was not a strength. It was a liability. It was a door left unlocked. And the people who came through unlocked doors were rarely the people you would have chosen if you'd been paying proper attention. He had paid attention. Starting early, by 15, he was working part-time for a local contractor. Learning not from the work itself, but from watching the men who ran the sites, which ones made decisions cleanly and which ones made them emotionally, what it cost each kind. By 22, he had a small renovation company and a rule he had never formally articulated but never once broken. Do excellent work, maintain complete professionalism, and do not let anyone matter more to you than the dung project does, the rule had held. Through a business partnership at 25, that ended with the other man walking away with financing Nathaniel had sourced and contacts Nathaniel had built. It had held through the company's first major crisis at 29, when a construction defect lawsuit nearly took everything, and the industry collectively waited to see if Crane would break. He had not broken. He had settled, restructured, and rebuilt with the kind of focused, bloodless efficiency that made people who watched it from the outside deeply uneasy in a way they couldn't quite name. It had held through Alina at 27. But that one had required more holding than the others, and he had learned from the effort. After Alina, the rule became less of a discipline and more of a reflex. By 35, it was simply the way Nathaniel Crane was built. And he had long since stopped examining the architecture. He was, by any metric that could be measured, doing extremely well at 2:04 in the morning. He was still at his desk. This was not unusual. Nathaniel routinely worked past midnight. Not because the work required it, but because the office, At that hour had a quality that the office during the day did not, a silence complete, enough that he could hear himself think without the ambient noise of other people's needs and functions pressing. At the edges of his concentration, he liked the building empty. He always had. He had the alderman file open on his secondary screen, not the current project documentation, but the original Phase 1 archives. Site assessments from 7 months ago. The initial contractor briefings. The consultant intake forms. He was not reading them. He was aware that he had opened them. He closed the file. He opened it again. The intake form for Voss Restoration Consulting was 3 pages. It contained Mara Voss's professional history, her firm's insurance documentation, 3 reference letters from previous clients, and a project methodology overview that his procurement team had flagged as unusually thorough for an initial submission, not in length, but in specificity. Most consultants at her level submitted methodology documents that were professionally polished and strategically vague. Hers had been precise in a way that suggested she had actually thought about the specific, building rather than recycling a template. He had noticed it at the time. He had not noted that he noticed it. Nathaniel leaned back in his chair and looked at the ceiling. He was not, told himself, doing anything significant. He was reviewing project documentation. This was a thing he did regularly. He was thorough. Thoroughness was a professional characteristic, not a symptom of anything. He looked at the message again. It has been a privilege contributing to this project. Formal, correct, exactly the right professional register. Warm enough to be courteous. Bounded enough to be final. He had written messages exactly like that himself, dozens of times when he had wanted to close a door cleanly. He knew what they meant. They meant, this is the last thing I intend to say about this. He set his phone down again, looked out at the city. The construction cranes were still. At this hour, the river of traffic had thinned to a slow, irregular pulse, single headlights moving through the dark at long intervals, each one appearing and disappearing with a completeness that had never bothered him before. He could not have explained. If asked why it bothered him now, he was tired. He had been working a 17-hour day. He would go home, sleep, and in the morning, the Alderman project would be exactly what it had been before. Mara Voss was attached to it a significant restoration contract, a civic heritage obligation, a line item in a portfolio of 47 active projects across 3 countries. It would be exactly what everything in Nathaniel Crane's life was. He picked up the phone one more time. Read the message a 3rd time. Put it down. He did not go home for another 2 hours. He could not have said what he was waiting for 7 months earlier. The Alderman's Civic Hall had been a beautiful ruin. That was the only honest way to describe it, not merely neglected, not simply damaged, but ruined in the specific way that buildings become ruined when they are loved for a long time and then abruptly abandoned. The roof had been partially compromised by a storm 12 years prior. Water had worked its way through the upper levels methodically, quietly, with the particular patience that water always has when given enough time and no one paying attention. The original plasterwork in the main hall, hand-applied, irreplaceable, dating to 1923, had bloomed with damp in 3 distinct sections. The structural timber above the mezzanine had softened in ways that did not yet threaten collapse, but would, within another 2 winters, almost certainly begin to. The building had been on Crane Infrastructure's acquisition list for 4 years before the heritage authorization finally cleared. Nathaniel had wanted it specifically, because everyone else had given up on it, because the restoration scope was large enough to deter competitors and complex, enough to require a quality of execution that most firms would not bother to achieve for a civic heritage project with constrained public funding. He had structured the deal creatively enough to make the numbers work, and had then handed it to his project team with a single instruction: do it properly. Doing it properly, turned out, required a specialist. His procurement director had sourced 3 restoration consultants for consideration. 2 of them submitted proposals that were technically sound and aesthetically adequate. The 3rd was Mara Voss. whose proposal had contained a 12-page preliminary analysis of the alderman's original construction methodology, sourced from municipal archives, cross-referenced with surviving documentation from the original building firm that functionally rendered the other two proposals obsolete by comparison. His procurement director had noted, "In forwarding the materials, she's not the cheapest option. She is clearly the right one." Nathaniel had approved the engagement without requesting a meeting. He rarely met consultants before contracts were signed. It wasn't necessary. The work either justified itself or it deep. She arrived on a Tuesday in late April, when the scaffolding on the east facade was still going up and the site was operating at the particular organized chaos of early stage. Restoration work, contractors moving in 3 directions, delivery schedules colliding, the project manager visibly managing for conversations simultaneously. Nathaniel was there for a morning site review, which was not something he typically attended personally for a project at this stage. And he had not examined his reason for being there. He was reviewing structural reports with his project. Engineered near the main entrance when he became aware of a woman crossing the site with the kind of deliberate, unhurried movement that immediately read as someone who knew exactly where she was going and did not feel the need to perform that knowledge for anyone watching. She was wearing a pale gray site jacket over dark work clothes, her dark hair pulled back, practically a worn leather document case under one arm. She was looking up at the east facade with an expression he could not immediately categorize, not inspection exactly. Something more like recognition. She stopped beside the scaffolding base, tipped her head slightly to the left, and stayed there for almost a full minute. Just looking, his project manager, who had been moving toward her, with the slightly harried energy of someone running 3 minutes behind schedule, slowed involuntarily when he reached her, as if her stillness imposed a kind of gravitational order on the surrounding chaos. "Nathaniel, watch this happen?" He turned back to the structural report. The site introduction was handled through his project manager. Standard procedure. Nathaniel did not typically involve himself in consultant onboarding on projects of this size. There were systems for it. The systems worked. He was therefore in no way responsible for the fact that 40 minutes later, he had walked through the main hall's interior and found Mara Voss crouched near the north wall, examining the damaged plasterwork with a small handheld light, making notes in a physical notebook rather than a tablet, with the focused, private quality of someone who had completely forgotten that anyone else was present. He stopped in the doorway. She did not look up. Whether she was unaware of him or simply undisturbed by him, he couldn't immediately tell. "The moisture damage goes further than the survey indicated," she said, without turning. "There's a secondary bloom behind the main section. You can see the edge of the discoloration starting here." She moved the light slightly. "If your team begins stabilization work based on the existing survey, they'll open the wall and find they've underscoped the repair by at least 30%. He walked over, crouched beside her, looked at where she was pointing. She was right. The secondary discoloration was subtle, the kind of thing that required knowing what to look for, but once seen, it was unambiguous. "The survey team was here 6 weeks ago," he said. "I know. I read their report. They're not wrong about what they documented." She sat back slightly and looked at the full wall rather than the detail. They just didn't know what question to ask. The original plaster in this hall was applied in 2 layers with different lime compositions. The 1923 restoration records confirm it. The outer layer presents differently to moisture than the inner layer does. If you're not looking for the differential, you'll miss the secondary bloom every time. She said this without any particular emphasis. Not as a correction. Not as a performance of expertise. Simply as information, offered in the direction of someone who might find it useful. Nathaniel stood. She stood. He was taller than her by a significant margin, but she had the quality, he noticed, of taking up precisely the space she occupied. No more. No less, with a kind of physical ease that was almost architectural in its efficiency. "I'm Nathaniel Crane," he said. "I know," she said. "Mara Voss." She offered her hand. Her grip was firm and brief. "I'll have a revised preliminary assessment to your project. Manager by Thursday that accounts for the secondary moisture mapping. It'll affect the Phase 2 timeline, By how much? Honestly, not significantly if we adjust the sequencing now. Significantly if we don't. She looked at the wall one more time, then at him directly. You'd rather know now? It was not a question. She had made a judgment about him based on available information and delivered it as fact. He observed that she was correct, and that this was mildly irritating. Thursday, he said. Thursday, she confirmed, and walked back toward the site entrance without any of the social coda that usually attended the end of such conversations. No, lovely to meet you. No, looking forward to working together. None of the warm patting that most people applied to professional first encounters. He stood in the damaged main hall for a moment after she left. He looked at the north wall, at the secondary moisture bloom she had found in 40 minutes that a survey team had missed entirely. He thought, briefly, about the quality of attention that required. Then he went back to work. The Thursday report arrived at 7:14. In the morning, before his assistant had come in. Before most of his team was online, and it was, as she had implied it would be, precise enough to be immediately actionable. 31 pages with full photographic documentation, archive cross-references, and a revised sequencing recommendation that his project manager confirmed would absorb the timeline impact if implemented within the next 2 weeks. Nathaniel read it at his desk with his morning coffee, which was a thing he almost never did with consultant reports. They were generally delegated to the relevant project team with a summary request, because his time was more efficiently spent on strategic decisions than on technical documentation. He read this one himself because he put the coffee down. He read it because the quality of the thinking in it was worth his time. That was the reason. That was a legitimate, professionally defensible reason. He forwarded it to his project manager with a note, implement the revised sequencing. This is correct. He did not note that he had read it fully. He did not note that 3 days later, at a completely unrelated site review for a different project entirely, he had found himself thinking about the specific thing she had said in the main hall. They just didn't know what question to ask, and had applied it to an unrelated problem, and it had been useful. He did not note any of it. There was nothing to note. She had done the work she was contracted to do, done it well, and delivered it on time. This was the expected outcome of a correctly sourced consultant. It was not remarkable, except that it was, a little, in the part of Nathaniel Crane that had spent 15 years building walls smooth enough that nothing could find purchase on them, had noticed carefully, quietly, the way you notice a small change in a building's foundation before you understand what it means. That she had found purchase anyway, not by trying. That was the part he could not file neatly away. Everyone who had ever gotten any distance into Nathaniel's life had done so by trying. By being persistent, or charming, or strategically useful, or emotionally relentless in one direction or another. He had systems for all of those approaches. He could recognize them early, appreciate them professionally, and maintain the appropriate distance without drama or difficulty. Mara Voss was not doing any of those things. She was doing her work. She was doing it with a quality of attention that was, in his experience, genuinely rare, the kind that came not from effort, but from something more native, more settled. She was not performing competence. She simply was competent, the way some materials are. Load-bearing not because they're trying to be, but because their structure allows no other outcome. He could not find a strategic explanation for why that was harder to keep at the correct distance than every other approach he had encountered. He filed the observation under irrelevant and moved on. He was very good at moving on for now. He was still managing it. The first time Nathaniel manufactured a reason to be at the Alderman site when there was no operational justification for his presence. He did not recognize it as manufacturing, he told himself, and the telling was smooth, immediate, entirely convincing that the Phase 2 sequencing adjustment had introduced enough complexity into the contractor coordination that a principal-level site review was warranted. This was technically defensible. It was also, as his project manager's expression briefly suggested, when Nathaniel appeared at the Tuesday morning briefing 6 weeks into the restoration. James Whitfield had been managing Crane infrastructure projects for 7 years and could count on one hand the number of times Nathaniel had attended a mid-phase site briefing for a single building restoration contract. He said nothing about it. James Whitfield was professionally intelligent in exactly the way Nathaniel valued. He observed, processed, and kept his observations to himself, unless directly useful. Nathaniel reviewed the contractor sequencing, asked 3 questions that were genuinely necessary, and spent 40 minutes walking the east wing with the site engineer reviewing the structural timber assessments. Mara was working in the mezzanine level when he passed through. She was deep in conversation with the lead plasterwork contractor, a man named Brennan, who had been doing heritage restoration for 30 years and had the specific professional pride of someone who considered most project managers an obstacle between himself and the work. Nathaniel had met dozens of men like Brennan. They were frequently right about the obstacle part. She was not managing him. She was listening to him fully, without the slight impatience that most people brought to listening when they already believed they knew the answer, and then she was asking him something that made Brennan pause, reconsider, and nod slowly in the manner of a man revising an opinion. He'd held for a long time. Nathaniel did not stop walking. He noted it the way he noted structurally significant things, with a kind of quiet, internal registration that asked no immediate follow-up questions. He came back the following Thursday. This time the justification was a material sourcing dispute. A lime supplier had flagged a potential delivery delay that could affect the Phase 2 plasterwork timeline, and Nathaniel had decided it required his direct attention. His procurement director had offered to handle it. Nathaniel had said he was in the area. He was not especially in the area. The material dispute took 20 minutes to resolve and required none of his specific authority. His project manager could have handled it with a single phone call. Afterward, without examining the decision, he walked through the main hall. The scaffolding was up on the north wall now, the damaged plasterwork exposed in sections, the careful forensic process of restoration underway. The hall smelled of lime and old timber, and something underneath both, a quality of age that wasn't unpleasant, more like the smell of time-made material. He had been in hundreds of old buildings. He did not usually notice that smell. Mara was on the scaffolding platform, 8 feet up, examining the exposed substrate with a light and what appeared to be a very small brush. She was working with the same private, completely absorbed quality he had noticed on the first day, the quality of someone for whom the work itself was sufficient company. He stood at the base of the scaffolding. The lime analysis came back, she said, without looking down. The inner substrate is a natural hydraulic lime. It's a slightly different composition than the 1923 record suggested. Better, actually. More stable. Brennan's adjusting the repair mix accordingly. You anticipated that? I thought it was possible. She moved the light a few inches. The archive records were working from the original specification, not the as-built. There's often a difference. Builders adapt on site. A brief pause. As they should. He looked up at the exposed wall. At the layers visible in cross-section, the outer decorative plaster, the intermediate coat, the substrate beneath, each one applied by a different hand at a different time. The whole system holding together across a century through material compatibility and structural logic. How long before this section is stable enough to begin the finish work? He asked. 6 weeks if the sequencing holds. She finally looked down at him. Her expression was professionally neutral, as it always was, not unfriendly. Simply unburdened by the social performance of friendliness. You didn't come for the lime analysis. It was not said as an accusation. It was said in the same register as everything she said, as information offered plainly, to someone who might find it useful. He held her gaze for a moment. The material sourcing dispute needed resolution, he said. James told me it was a 20-minute phone call. Look back at the wall. I'm not asking you to explain yourself, Mr. Crane. I'm just noting that the building is doing fine. He left shortly after. He drove back to the office with the specific, focused blankness he applied to things he did not intend to examine. and he spent the rest of the afternoon in a financial review meeting. And he did not think about what she had said. He thought about it at 11 that night, alone in his apartment, and identified the feeling it produced as something adjacent to irritation, which was close enough to file it under and move on. By the 6th week, the pattern had established itself with the quiet inevitability of a structural habit, something that exists not because it was decided, but because it was repeated often, enough to become load-bearing without anyone authorizing it. He was at the site, on average, twice a week. The justifications evolved with creative fluency. A contractor performance review that his operations team could have conducted, a heritage authority liaison meeting that his project manager attended as well, making Nathaniel's presence redundant, a detailed review of the mezzanine structural report that was, objectively, not something that required the CEO of a $4 billion company to read. Personally on location, he brought harder problems. This was the part he recognized least clearly in himself, the way he began complicating the project in small, precise ways that created genuine technical challenges requiring the specific quality of thinking that Mara brought to them. Not sabotage. Nothing that endangered the building or the timeline in ways that couldn't be managed. But a scope refinement here, an additional heritage compliance requirement there, a request to extend the material analysis to include sections of the building that were not strictly within the original brief. He told himself it was thoroughness. Crane Infrastructure's reputation was built on doing things properly. Doing things properly sometimes meant expanding scope when the situation warranted. Mara handled every addition without complaint and without particular enthusiasm, with the same level. Complete engagement she brought to everything, and each time she delivered a solution, it had the quality that her work always had. It was not just correct. It was the right question answered in addition to the question asked. 3 months in, she walked into a contractor coordination meeting Nathaniel was running and set a revised material schedule on the table in front of him. "You've added 4 scope items in the last 2 weeks," she said. "All of them legitimate. All of them manageable." She sat down across from him. The other 3 people in the room became very still in the particular way that people become still when they sense an atmospheric change. "I want to make sure we're aligned on the end state before the next phase authorization. Because if the scope continues to expand at this rate, we'll need to restructure the Phase 3 budget, and I'd rather do that now than in 6 weeks. "Agreed," he said. "Let's review the scope items." They spent 90 minutes going through each addition. She had already prepared cost and timeline implications for all 4 documents he had not requested, produced because she had anticipated that they would be needed. The meeting was entirely professional and substantively productive. When the others had left, he was stacking papers at the end of the table when she said, without particular emphasis, "You're making this harder than it needs to be." He looked up. "I project," she said, and there was something in the slight pause before the clarification that suggested she was aware it could have meant something else. "You keep adding complexity. Not arbitrarily. The additions are always grounded. But the building doesn't need all of it." She picked up her document case. "I'm not sure what it is you're actually looking for in there, but I don't think it's in the plasterwork." The room was quiet. He had been managed, gently and precisely, by contractors, attorneys, board members, an opposing counsel, and high-stakes negotiations. He had been flattered, challenged, and occasionally threatened by people who wanted things from him. He had a response architecture for all of it, smooth, well-maintained, completely reliable. He had no response. Architecture for someone simply being accurate. "Review the Phase 3 scope before the next authorization meeting," he said. "That would be helpful." Nodded once, not a bow, just an acknowledgement. Person to person, and left. He stood at the end of the conference table for a moment. Outside, through the site office window, he could see the Alderman Building's restored east facade, catching the late afternoon light, the cleaned stonework pale gold. The repaired window surrounds precise and clean. The scaffolding gone now from that section. The building emerging from its ruin with a solidity that had been there all along. waiting for someone to find it. He had a thought he did not fully form something. He doubted the difference between a building that looked sound and a building that was sound, and how from the outside you often could not tell which was which until someone who knew what questions to ask started looking at the walls. He did not complete the thought. He picked up his papers and left. That night in his apartment, the clean, precisely furnished apartment that contained every comfort and very little evidence of the specific person who lived in it, he sat by the window with a glass of whiskey he wasn't drinking and considered the fact that Mara Voss was the only person in recent memory who had said something true about him and then simply walked away from it. No follow-up. No emotional investment in whether he received it. No performance of concern or frustration or care. Just the thing itself. Offered plainly, and then the door closed. Quietly behind her, he tried to identify what made that different from every other form of professional frankness he had encountered in his career, and found that he could not entirely complete the analysis. There was something in the absence of need, the way she said true things without requiring him to respond to them in any particular way, that his internal system had no clean category. 4. Everyone who said true things to Nathaniel Crane wanted something in return for the saying: acknowledgement, gratitude, a response that confirmed they had landed. Mara said true things the way she examined plasterwork. Yeah, because the truth was there, and it was relevant, and ignoring it would only create larger problems later. He was not. He told himself, unsettled by this. He looked at the whiskey. He admitted to no one, a little unsettled by this. The Heritage Authority required a formal progress documentation session at the 5-month mark. A walkthrough with an appointed inspector. Photographic and written records of the restoration work completed to date. An assigned compliance confirmation before Phase 3 funding could be authorized. It was administratively a half-day process. Nathaniel's project manager was fully qualified to lead it. There was no operational reason for Nathaniel to attend. He attended. The inspector, a careful, methodical woman named Dr. Okafor, who had been assessing heritage restoration projects for the city for 20 years. Spent 4 hours moving through the building with Mara, asking technical questions that Mara answered with the same unhurried precision she brought to everything. Nathaniel followed at the appropriate distance, said almost nothing, and observed the way Mara described the restoration philosophy to Dr. Okafor, not as a series of technical interventions, but as a conversation with the building's original intent. The phrase she used was, "We're not trying to make it look like nothing happened. We're trying to make it honest about what it survived." Dr. Okafor wrote it down. Nathaniel did not write it down. He did not need to. It stayed without being asked to, by 4 in the afternoon. The inspection was complete, the documentation signed, and the Phase 3 funding confirmed. Dr. Okafor left. The contractors had finished for the day. The site quieted in the particular way that construction sites quiet at end-of-day tools, stowed. Equipment stilled, the building exhaling into its own silence. Nathaniel was reviewing the signed documentation in the site office when Mara appeared in the doorway. "Brennan's team finished the north wall finish coat today," she said. "It needs to be seen before the site lights go down." He looked up. "The curing will change the color slightly by tomorrow," she added. "Right now, it's as close to the original as it's going to get. If you want to see what you've paid for, this is the hour." The main hall at that hour was extraordinary. He had been in the building dozens of times over 5 months. He had watched it move incrementally from ruin toward recovery, the scaffolding going up and coming down, the damaged sections exposed and addressed, the structural work completed quietly beneath the surface before the visible work could begin. He had seen it at every stage of the process. He had not seen it like this. The late afternoon light came through the restored west windows at a low angle, falling across the north wall's newly finished plasterwork in a way that revealed the surface as a surface not flat, not uniform, but alive with the slight texture of hand application, the kind of variation that machines cannot produce and time cannot fake. The color was warm, a white with depth, the particular quality of lime plaster that absorbs and reflects light differently depending on the hour. In the raking light of late afternoon it looked, Nathaniel thought, like something that had always been there. Which was, he supposed, exactly the point. Mara stood beside him and said nothing for a long moment. "Brennan did good work," she said finally. "The whole team did." "The whole team did," she agreed. "But Brennan's the one who's been doing this for 30 years because he actually loves it. You can tell the difference." She looked at the wall with the expression he had seen on the first day, the one he still could not entirely categorize. Some people do things because they're good at them. Some people are good at things because they can't imagine not doing them. The work looks different. "Which are you?" he asked. She glanced at him briefly, the way she did when a question surprised her slightly. Not thrown, just registering. "The second kind. Obviously." The obvious was not unkind, just factual. "You know that already." "I do," he said. The admission arrived without strategy. He had not planned it. He observed its arrival with the slight internal displacement of a man who has been operating on autopilot, and has just felt the controls shift under his hands. The light moved. Outside, the sun had dropped below the adjacent roofline, and the hall shifted. The warm gold softening to something cooler, the plasterwork settling into a quieter version of itself. The building felt, at this hour, genuinely at rest. "Why infrastructure?" she asked. He looked at her. She was still looking at the wall. "Most people who build empires in construction go into development," she said. "New buildings. Clean sites. You can control every variable from the ground up. Infrastructure is older systems, roads, bridges, civic structures, things that already exist and need to be maintained, upgraded, worked around. Things with complicated histories," considered several answers. He had a set of well-maintained responses to the question of why infrastructure efficient, professionally framed narratives about market, positioning and long-term value, and the underinvestment in civic systems that had created an opportunity he had been positioned to address. He had given versions of this answer in boardrooms and interviews and industry panels for 15 years. "My father drove a delivery route," he said instead. She turned slightly toward him. "Same roads for 22 years. He knew every pothole, every degraded section, every bridge that shuttered wrong. He used to describe them at dinner, which ones had gotten worse, which ones the city had patched badly, which ones he was worried about." A pause. "He cared about them in a way I didn't understand when I was a kid. He didn't own them. They were never going to make him any money. But they were his in some way. He couldn't explain." He looked at the wall. "I think I understood what I wanted to do before I understood why." The hall was quiet. From somewhere in the upper levels, the building made the small settling sound that old buildings make when the temperature shifts, a creak of timber. A minor adjustment, nothing alarming. Just the building being a building. "That's the most I've heard you say about yourself in 5 months, Mara said. "You haven't asked before?" "No," she agreed. She did not say, "Because I knew you wouldn't answer." She did not need to. He was aware that the conversation had moved. Not into territory that was professionally inappropriate, nothing so dramatic as that, but into a different quality of space than the one they usually occupied. The professional scaffolding was still present, but it was bearing less of the weight than it normally did, and the thing underneath it, whatever it was visible in the way the original plasterwork was visible in the raking light, not hidden, just not usually the thing you were looking at. "What made you stop?" she asked. He looked at her. "You were going to ask me something," she said. "Just now? You decided not to?" He had been. He had been going to ask her something that was, in retrospect, a version of, "Do you find it lonely, doing work that most people can't fully see?" Which was not really a question about her work at all, and they both would have known it. "It wasn't a useful question," he said. She held his gaze for a moment. Her expression was not disappointed, not amused. It had the quality her silences always had of someone who had arrived at an accurate understanding and was simply holding it without requiring him to confirm it. "Useful questions usually aren't," she said, and looked back at the wall. They stood there for another few minutes in a silence that was not uncomfortable, which was itself notable. Because Nathaniel's silences with other people were almost always load-bearing, filled with the structural tension of what was not being said. This one was different. It had the quality of the hall itself at this hour, settled, honest, at rest. He became aware of it too clearly. That was the problem. Should let you close up the site. He said, probably, said it without any particular inflection, not pushing him out, not asking him to stay. He picked up the documentation folder, moved toward the main entrance. At the threshold he stopped, not intentionally, not as a gesture, just stopped and looked back at the hall one more time. At the north wall and the last of the light. At the work that had been done carefully and well, and would now hold for another 100 years if no one neglected it. At Mara, still standing in the middle of the hall, making a final note in her physical notebook, already back inside the work, already sufficient to herself. He drove home through the evening traffic, with the windows down. Despite the October cold, a thing he never did, and somewhere on the bridge over the river, he had the clearest thought he'd had in months, which arrived not as words, but as a physical sensation. The way certain structural realizations arrive, not as information processed, but as weight. Felt he was not afraid of the building falling. He was afraid of what it would mean if it didn't, if it stood, its fully restored work completed. Project closed, if the thing that had justified his presence there every Tuesday and Thursday for 5 months reached its natural and successful conclusion, and there would be no more legitimate reasons, and he would have to decide without the cover of operational necessity whether he was willing to do something he had not done in 15 years, want something he couldn't frame as a project. The traffic moved. The bridge ended. The city continued. He turned the heat on, because it was cold, and denying that it was cold served no function. He did not examine whether the same logic applied to anything else. That night, in the clean, spare apartment, he stood in the kitchen for a long time without making anything. The refrigerator ran. The building settled. Outside, the city made its continuous ambient noise, the sound of 10,000 systems operating, maintaining, moving. He thought about what she had said. We're not trying to make it look like nothing happened. We're trying to make it honest about what it survived. He thought about the question he hadn't asked. He thought about the way she had known he was going to ask it. He thought about the fact that in 5 months of working alongside him, across dozens of site visits and meetings and scope reviews, and one late afternoon in a restored hall full of failing light, Mara Voss had never once asked him for anything that wasn't strictly professional, had never performed warmth to get his attention, had never leveraged their proximity for anything other than the work itself. He thought about how strange that was. He thought about how it was not strange at all. He opened his laptop, had worked until 2 in the morning. When he finally stopped, it was not because he was tired. It was because he had run out of things to put between himself and the simple, unadorned fact that had been building quietly in him for months. The way moisture builds in old walls, not visible yet from the outside. Not yet causing damage, but present, working. Patient in the way that only things that have found their way in through the smallest gap can afford to be patient. He put the laptop away. He did not sleep. While this was becoming a pattern, the Thursday she didn't appear. Nathaniel didn't notice immediately. This was the first thing that bothered him afterward, not the absence itself, but the delay in registering it. He had arrived at the site at 9 for a contractor progress review, moved through the morning with his project manager, reviewed the Phase 3 material deliveries, signed off on 2 contractor invoices, and was 40 minutes into a structural walkthrough of the upper level before. Something in his peripheral awareness raised a flag that he couldn't immediately identify. He stopped on the mezzanine. Landing looked down into the main hall. The north wall was complete, fully cured now, settled into its permanent form, the color exactly as she had predicted it would be. Slightly quieter than the evening they had stood watching it together. Brennan's team was working on the East Arcade detailing. The sound of careful tool work rising in the specific rhythmic pattern of people who knew what they were doing. Everything was in order. He went back to the walkthrough. It was only at the end of the site review, when his project manager was running through the afternoon schedule, that Nathaniel said with a casualness he did not examine, "Is Voss on site today?" James checked his coordination sheet. "She sent a message through the office this morning. Personal appointment. She'll have any outstanding items to us by end of week." Nathaniel nodded. Moved on. He was in his car by 2 o'clock. On the bridge over the river, the same bridge, he realized that the flag his peripheral awareness had raised at 40 minutes into the walkthrough was not a structural concern or a project irregularity. It was her absence, he had noticed, without consciously noticing that she wasn't there. His internal system had registered the gap before his conscious attention had caught up with it. He drove the rest of the way to the office with the particular, focused blankness of a man, performing normalcy for an audience of no one. She was back the following Tuesday. He knew because James mentioned it in the morning briefing, not significantly. Just as a scheduling note, the way James mentioned everything cleanly. Without editorializing, Nathaniel did not go to the site that Tuesday. This was the first Tuesday in 11 weeks that he had not found a reason to be there. He told himself it was a scheduling conflict, which was partially true. There was a board call at 3 that genuinely required his preparation. He told himself this was the natural return to a normal operational pattern, that the frequency of his site visits over the previous months had been project-driven and was now appropriately reducing as Phase 3 progressed, and the work required less principal oversight. He told himself both of these things in the particular way he had. I always told himself things that needed to be believed quickly, efficiently, without leaving space for the counter-argument. He did not go on Thursday either. The project closure request arrived on a Thursday. 11 days after the Tuesday he hadn't gone, he read it at 11:47 in the morning, set his phone down, and went back to work. This was where the story had begun. This was the moment the narration had opened on. The image the whole preceding structure had been leading toward, and what it had not conveyed in that opening, was how completely ordinary the moment felt from the inside. That was the thing about the architecture Nathaniel had built. It was so well constructed that even its failures felt like function. He read the closure message, and his system processed it as project concluding, consultant disengaging, standard professional protocol. The response it generated was confirm receipt, process final invoice, update project records. He did all three things. He did not feel in that moment what he was losing. He felt the smooth, efficient operation of a system doing what it was designed to do. The feeling came later. That was always how it worked with walls, this well-built. Not a sudden breach, but a slow, structural truth announcing itself through symptoms you misread for weeks before you understand their source. The first symptom was productivity in the 2 weeks following the closure message. Nathaniel was the most operationally effective he had been in months. He cleared a backlog of strategic decisions that had been accumulating during the period of his heightened alderman involvement. He ran 3 board sessions with unusual sharpness. He closed a financing negotiation that his legal team had expected to take another month in 11 days. Through a combination of preparation and a quality of focused relentlessness that his counterparts found, by their own admission, somewhat unnerving. He worked 16-hour days without noticing the hours. This was the first symptom. The specific hyperproductivity of a person who has found something intolerable and is covering it with function. He had seen it before in other people, the recently bereaved who reorganized their entire house in a week, the newly alone who sign up for 3 new professional commitments in a month. He had never applied the pattern to himself because he had never had the source material. He did not apply it to himself now. He received his own productivity as confirmation that everything was fine. Better than fine. He was operating at full capacity, which was where he was supposed to be. The second symptom was sleep, or more precisely, its increasing refusal to arrive on schedule. Nathaniel had always been a disciplined sleeper. He understood rest as a performance input, the same way he understood nutrition and exercise, not as pleasure but as maintenance. The regular servicing of a system that needed to function at high output. He had gone to bed at 11 and woken at 6 for 15 years, with the reliability of a well-calibrated mechanism. Starting the week after the closure message, he found himself awake at 2, 3, 4 in the morning with a restless, directionless energy that had no obvious source and no productive outlet. He would lie in the clean, spare bedroom of the clean, spare apartment, and his mind would move not through work problems, which he could have engaged with, but through something less structured and more difficult to manage. Fragments. The restored hall in the late afternoon light. The way she had said, obviously without unkindness. The question he hadn't asked. The notebook she wrote in by hand. He got up and worked. The work helped for a while and then stopped helping, and he went back to bed and lay in the dark. And this became, without announcement, the new pattern. The third symptom was the one that should have been diagnostic but wasn't, because it presented in a form he couldn't recognize. He started finding the office at any hour. Insufficient? He had loved the office at 2 in the morning for years, the silence, the completeness of the empty building, the quality of being the only person present. It had been, in some private way, he had never examined. His preferred state, surrounded by the infrastructure of connection, the desks, the systems, the evidence of other people's work, while being entirely and sovereignly alone within it. He sat at his desk at 2 in the morning 3 weeks. After the closure message and looked at the city through the floor-to-ceiling window and understood, with a clarity that was almost physical, that the silence he had always valued was not peaceful. It had always been empty. He had called it peaceful, because peaceful was a better name for it. He looked at the 41 floors of empty air between himself and the street. He got up and made coffee he didn't want and stood in the small kitchen alcove off the main office and thought about nothing specific, which meant he thought about everything he was not examining, which was its own form of examination. By the 4th week, he had reconstructed their entire working relationship from memory. This was not a decision. It was what his mind did in the hours when he refused to let it work and refused to let it rest. It went back to the alderman. Moved through the months, examined the accumulated record of interactions with the focused, systematic attention of a man who was professionally excellent at finding the point where structure had begun to fail. He was looking for the moment. It had gone wrong. He could not find it. He went back further, examined more carefully, applied greater analytical pressure to each exchange. The first day in the main hall, the secondary moisture bloom, her plain-spoken competence, the handshake that was firm and brief, the Thursday report at 7:14 in the morning, the site visits he had manufactured, the scope additions, the meeting where she had told him he was making the project harder than it needed to be, the late afternoon in the restored hall, the north wall in the failing light, the question he hadn't asked. He examined all of it with the thoroughness he brought to structural assessments and arrived at the same conclusion every time. It had not gone wrong. There was no failure point. There was no breach he could identify, no moment where something had broken or been mishandled. The project had concluded. She had closed it professionally, correctly, with exactly the warmth and finality that the situation warranted. There was nothing wrong, which meant that the thing he was feeling, the sleeplessness, the insufficient silence, the hollow productivity of a man running very fast inside a room with no exits, was not a response to something going wrong. It was a response to something never having been allowed to go. Right? He sat with that for a long time in the office at 3 in the morning, with the untouched coffee cooling on the desk. Beside him, he had spent 15 years building a system specifically designed to prevent this feeling, to ensure that no person could occupy enough of his internal architecture, to leave a structural gap when they withdrew. He had been meticulous about it. He had maintained appropriate distances, kept emotional investments calibrated to safe levels, exited every situation before it could exit him. The system had worked perfectly every time. And then Mara Voss had come onto a restoration site and done her work with a quality of attention he had no category Foreign had never once tried to get close to him. And the system, the whole, careful, costly, 15-year system had failed completely without either of them touching it. She had not gotten in through the door. The door had been locked. The walls had been maintained. She had simply been there, doing something real, and the walls had decided on their own that they were tired. He stood up, walked to the window, looked at the city 41 floors below. A single car moved through the empty boulevard, headlights cutting clean through the dark, there and then gone. The night closing behind it as if it had never passed. The office was silent. He understood now. Standing inside a building he had designed and built and maintained for 15 years, and he was finally at 3 a.m. on a Tuesday in November. Able to see it clearly from the inside, it was sound. It was well constructed. Every joint was tight, every surface maintained, every system functional. It was also completely, irreversibly empty, and the man who had built it was standing at the window understanding, for the first time. That empty had never been the same thing as safe. It had only ever been the thing he had called safe because he could not afford to call it what it was. The call took him 12 days to make, not because he was undecided. He had known, somewhere in the vicinity of the third sleepless week, that he was going to make it. But there was a significant difference between knowing you were going to do something and being willing to do it. And Nathaniel Crane had spent 15 years perfecting the management of that gap. He could hold a decision in suspension for extraordinary lengths of time, examining it from every professional angle, building the justification structure carefully enough that when he finally acted, it felt like logic rather than need. The justification he constructed for this particular call was professional due diligence. Mara Voss had performed exceptionally on the Alderman project. Crane Infrastructure occasionally retained consultants for extended framework agreements, preferred supplier arrangements that streamlined procurement for future projects. It was entirely reasonable from an operational standpoint to conduct informal market soundings about a consultant's broader reputation and availability before initiating a formal restated framework discussion. This was a thing that happened. His procurement team did versions of it regularly. He did not involve his procurement team. The contact was a man named Philip Reeves, a Heritage Foundation director who operated across the same civic restoration sector as Mara and had been. As far as Nathaniel knew from the professional network they occasionally shared, a long-standing figure in her industry circle. He was not a close contact of Nathaniel's. They had met at 2 industry events and had exchanged perhaps a dozen emails over 4 years on matters of mutual professional interest. He was, however, exactly the kind of peripheral professional connection that made a reference inquiry feel unforced. Nathaniel called him on a Wednesday morning. From his office, with the door closed, he framed it as he had planned: informal market sounding. Potential framework discussion. Wanted to understand Voss Restoration Consulting's broader profile before initiating anything formal. Reeves was amiable and unhurried, a man who enjoyed professional conversation and did not rush it, and he spoke about Mara with the specific warmth of someone who had watched a career develop over time and taken quiet satisfaction. In it she was, Reeves said, among the best in her field, not just technically, but philosophically. She had a way of approaching restoration work that most practitioners didn't develop until much later in their careers. If at all, the understanding that a building's history was not an obstacle to its recovery, but the actual material you were working with. He had seen her talk a heritage authority out of a historically inaccurate restoration specification that would have looked correct and been a fundamental lie, which had taken both the expertise to know the difference and the character to press the point against institutional resistance. Nathaniel asked about her working style on complex projects, specifically projects where the principal client was demanding or difficult. Reeves laughed, not unkindly. She doesn't have much difficulty with difficult clients, he said. She has a way of just not engaging with the performance of it. You can be as demanding as you like, and she'll take the legitimate parts seriously and let the rest go without comment. I've seen her outlast some genuinely challenging personalities without appearing to try. Does she enjoy that kind of project? Nathaniel asked. He kept his voice entirely level. The demanding ones. A brief pause on the other end. The quality of pause that meant someone was sorting through what they actually knew versus what they generally believed. I spoke with her recently, Reeves said. After the Alderman project wrapped. She mentioned it specifically, said it was the most intellectually alive she'd felt on a project in years. Another pause. Shorter. She said something I thought was interesting. She said the work itself was exceptional. The building deserved everything it got. But that she'd also learned something she'd had to learn a few times before. She said she knew better than to wait for people who'd already decided not to be available. And the office was very quiet. Nathaniel was aware of the city outside the window, the way you become aware of ambient sound when something inside the room stops, suddenly present. Suddenly loud? She said that? He asked. Something to that effect. Reeves was moving on. Professionally, the comment had been, for him, a minor observation, a conversational footnote. She seemed well, clear-headed. She's got a significant independent project starting in the new year. A 19th century library restoration in the outer districts, privately funded. Good work. Nathaniel asked 2 more questions that he processed approximately none of. He thanked Reeves. He ended the call. He set the phone on the desk. She knew better than to wait for people who'd already decided not to be available. He sat with it. He had expected. In the private, unexamined part of himself that had constructed the justification for this call, to find something that reframed the situation, some piece of information that would reorganize what he thought he understood. A revelation about her circumstances or her intentions, or some quality of the dynamic between them that his analysis had missed. He had been looking, without admitting it, for the thing that would tell him what to do next. He had found something instead that told him what had already been done. She had seen him clearly. Not with bitterness, not with the particular grievance of someone who had invested and been denied, but with the clean, unsentimental accuracy of a person who assessed situations the way she assessed buildings, without wishful thinking. Without the distortion of wanting the structure to be something other than what it was, she had looked at. Nathaniel Crane at the site visits that were not site visits. The scope additions that were not scope additions. The conversations that briefly stopped being professional and then were immediately recovered. The question not asked, and she had understood the whole architecture of it. Not as a romantic failure. Not even as a disappointment particularly. As a fact about a person, this one has decided not to be available, and she had made her own decision accordingly. With exactly the self-possession she brought to everything, she had not waited. She had not hoped that proximity would change the structure. She had done what she always did, assessed what was real, not what she might prefer to be real, and acted from that assessment without drama or delay. She had chosen her own peace. He looked at his. Hands on the desk. He had spent 15 years afraid of being known specifically. Afraid of being known and then left. Of giving someone access to the actual architecture and watching them find it insufficient. The fear had been so successfully managed, so thoroughly built around, that he had long since stopped being aware of it as fear. It had become, simply, the way he operated. The distances he kept were not distances at all from the inside. They were just the natural dimensions of the space he occupied. What Philip Reeves had just told him, in the offhand tone of a man passing along minor professional gossip, was that Mara Voss had seen through every layer. Of that to the fear underneath had seen it with the same accuracy she applied to secondary moisture, blooms and misspecified lime compositions, and had not left. Because she found it insufficient. She had left because she had found it finished. There is a difference. He understood it now with the specific, unwelcome clarity of a structural realization that has been delayed too long, the kind that arrives not as new information, but as the sudden legibility of information that was always there. She had not decided he was insufficient. She had decided he was unavailable. And she had been entirely, precisely right. He left the office at noon, which he almost never did. He walked not toward anywhere specific, just into the city, through the midday crowd. Past the construction sites and the civic buildings and the infrastructure of a city that was, as it always was, in the continuous process of maintaining itself, repairing itself, finding ways to remain functional, under the accumulated pressure of time and use and weather, and the basic indifference of years. He walked past a road resurfacing crew working on a section of the boulevard. 3 men in high-visibility jackets operating with the quiet, competent focus of people doing unglamorous work well. He thought about his father describing the roads at dinner. Which ones had gotten worse? Which ones the city had patched badly? The ones he was worried about. His father had understood something that Nathaniel had extracted the wrong lesson from. His father's availability, his emotional openness, his willingness to be present and attached and consequently hurt, had looked from the outside of a difficult childhood like weakness, like the design flaw that had cost him things. Nathaniel had looked at his father's life and concluded that closeness was the structural error, that the solution was to build tighter, control more, keep the distances clean. He stopped at a crossing, waited for the light. What he had not understood until approximately right now, on a Wednesday noon, on a street he had no particular reason to be walking, was that his father's openness had not been the thing that cost him. The things that cost his father were specific circumstances and specific people. Bad luck, bad choices, the ordinary human difficulty of being alive in the world with other people who were also just trying. His father had been hurt. He had also been loved. He had also been, in ways Nathaniel had never fully credited, genuinely present in his own life in a way that Nathaniel, with all his control, all his architecture, all his well-maintained distances, had never managed. The light changed. He crossed. He had built a life that protected him from the specific pain his father had experienced. He had succeeded completely. He had also, in the same construction, protected himself from everything else, from the kind of work that felt like the most intellectually alive she'd felt in years, from the kind of presence that made a restoration contractor revise a 30-year opinion, from the kind of moment where you stand in a hall full of failing light and the silence between. 2 people is not empty, but full. He had been so focused on what he was, keeping out, that he had never fully accounted for what he was keeping in. He found himself, without having planned it, on the street that ran alongside the Alderman Civic Hall. He stopped. The building was mid-phase. 3 now, the exterior largely complete, the scaffolding down from the south facade, the restored stonework clean and pale in the November light. From the street, you could see the repaired window surrounds, the repointed masonry, the careful work of the past 7 months made legible in the building's renewed solidity. It looked from here like a building that had always been sound, which was, he thought, the whole point. And also not the point at all. The point, the thing Mara had said on the first day in the main hall, which had stayed without being asked, was that restoration was not about making it look like nothing happened. It was about making it honest about what it survived. He stood on the pavement and looked at the building. For a long time, he was 41 floors and 15 years away from the last time he had stood somewhere and understood, with complete honesty, what he had survived and what it had cost. He was a man who had built an empire on the principle of structural integrity and had applied that principle to everything except himself, who had maintained every external system with meticulous care while the interior went unexamined, unfaced, gradually compromising its own load-bearing capacity in ways that didn't show from the outside until the moment something tested it properly. She had tested it without trying to. That was still the part he couldn't entirely process. He took out his phone, looked at it. He had her contact details in the project files, professional details, the ones she had submitted with her initial consultant intake form 8 months ago. He had no right, by any reasonable social or professional protocol, to use them for anything other than a project-related communication. The project was closed. She had closed it. He put the phone away. There were things that could not be corrected with a phone call. And he understood enough about structures, about what they needed and what you couldn't shortcut, to know that whatever came next could not be unplanned and impulsive, could not be the emotional equivalent of a fast patch on a compromised section of wall, something that looked like a repair from the outside. It failed quietly from within. If anything came next, it had to be real. He wasn't sure yet that he knew how to do real. He had the first honest understanding of his own architecture that he'd had in 15 years, and it was necessary and it was not sufficient. And he knew the difference. But he knew where she was working. Reeves had told him. A 19th century library in the outer districts. He had time to figure out what he was actually going to say. For the first time in a long time, he was going to use it. He gave himself 2 weeks. This was not procrastination, or it was not only procrastination. It was the recognition, arrived at with unusual honesty, that showing up at a restoration site with nothing but the raw material of a recent self-realization was not a plan. It was a gesture, and gestures, in Nathaniel's experience, were what people substituted for substance when they hadn't done the actual work yet. He did not want to show up with a gesture, so he gave himself 2 weeks and he used them, not to prepare a speech, which he understood would be exactly the wrong approach, but to do something he had not done seriously since. He was a young man working out whether the construction industry was where he actually belonged, or just where he had accidentally become competent. He sat with himself, quietly, without the buffer of work or productivity or the ambient noise of a system running at full capacity. He sat in the apartment in the evenings after the work was done, and he did not turn on the television, and he did not open his laptop, and he did not fill the silence with anything. He let it be silent. He let it be empty in the way it had always been empty. But now, without calling that emptiness something it wasn't, it was uncomfortable in a way. It was completely unlike the discomforts he was practiced at managing. There was no opposing party, no negotiation, no technical problem with a definable solution. There was just a man in a room looking at the shape of the life he had built, trying to understand it honestly enough to say something true about it to another person. On the 14th day he drove to the outer districts. The library was on a residential street that the city's development had moved away from rather than toward. A neighborhood of Victorian terraces and corner shops and the particular quiet of areas that had been overlooked. Long enough to develop their own self-contained character, the building itself was set back slightly from the street behind a low iron fence, a narrow front garden gone to seed. The facade a dark London stock brick with sandstone dressings that had weathered to a warm amber. It was, objectively, not a large or architecturally significant building. It had the quality of something that had mattered enormously to a specific community for a long time, and had then been left behind when the community changed. He could see, from the street, that the roof had been recently secured, new lead flashings, replaced ridge tiles, the structural work done first, as it should be. The windows on the ground floor were boarded but cleanly so, with ventilation provisions cut in. Someone had placed a small handwritten notice on the front gate. Restoration in progress. Private project. Please do not enter. Please do not enter. He stood at the gate for a moment. He opened it and went in. The front door was unlocked, propped open with a brick in the manner of working sites everywhere, and from inside came the sounds of active restoration. The careful percussion of tool work, a radio playing low, the particular acoustic quality of a building with its interior exposed, all bare plaster and bare timber, and the amplified echo of work in progress. He stepped inside. The entrance hall was narrow. Original encaustic tile floor partially visible where a covering of later linoleum had been carefully peeled back. The walls were stripped to the substrate, ready for assessment. A temporary site lighting rig ran along the ceiling. On a folding table near the inner door, a flask, an open notebook, 3 reference books with tabs marking multiple pages, an empty coffee cup. He looked at the notebook. He did not read it through the inner door. The main library space opened up 2 stories. A cast-iron gallery running around 3 sides at the upper level. The original shelving still in place on the ground floor, though emptied and partially stabilized. The light came from the tall, south-facing windows, the boarding removed from two of them. Afternoon light falling in long rectangles across the original timber floor. Mara was on the gallery level. Out. 15 feet up, examining the cast-iron balustrade with what appeared to be a thickness gauge and making notes without looking up from the work. She was in her sight clothes, dark jacket, work trousers, hair back, and she had the quality she always had on sight, of being entirely inside what she was doing, unreachable by anything. Outside it, he stood at the entrance to the main space. She looked down. Her expression went through something not shock, not distress, something more precise and more complicated. A recognition. And then, in the space of perhaps 2 seconds, a settling the specific quality of someone who has thought about a possibility enough that when it arrives it finds them prepared. She did not say his name. She did not say anything immediately. She finished the measurement she was taking, made the note, capped the gauge. Then she came down the cast-iron staircase at the end of the gallery with the sure-footed ease of someone completely at home in working buildings. And when she reached the ground floor, she was perhaps 10 feet from him. And the space between them had the quality of the hall at the Alderman on that last evening full. Somehow, without anything being said, you found it, she said. Reeves mentioned it. She nodded once. Not surprised. How's the Alderman? Phase 3 is on schedule. Brennan's team is finishing the arcade detailing. Good. She meant it genuinely, without qualification. Whatever had passed between them, or not passed between them, she cared about the building. He had always known that. He'll do it well. He will. The radio played something low and indistinct from the back of the building. The afternoon light moved slightly as a cloud passed outside. The library held its breath. I shouldn't have closed the project without a conversation, he said. She looked at him steadily. You didn't close it. I did, I know. I mean, he stopped. Started again without the scaffolding this time. I created the conditions that made it the right decision for you. I know that. I'm not here to suggest otherwise. She waited. This was the thing about her silences. They didn't pressure. They didn't perform patience. They were simply open space into which you could put something real if you chose to, or into which you could put something managed and rehearsed if that was what you arrived with. They would hold either one without judgment. But she would know the difference. I've been thinking about something you said, he continued. On the Alderman, the first day. About the survey team, that they weren't wrong about what they documented. They just didn't know what question to ask. A slight shift in her expression. Not surprise exactly. More like attention, sharpening. I've been applying the wrong question to my own life for about 15 years, he said. I've been asking how to keep things functional. How to maintain the system. I never asked what the system was actually for. He paused. I think I've been building a very well-maintained empty building and calling it stability. The afternoon light shifted again. From the upper level, the cast-iron gallery held its lines, precise, structural, unchanged by anything happening below it. It's an honest thing to say, Mara said. It's about 12 years late. Yes, it said it without cruelty. Without the particular edge that honesty can carry when it's being used as a weapon, just as fact plainly. It is, he had more. He had spent 2 weeks arriving at more, and he was prepared to offer it, the architecture of his father. The lessons extracted and misapplied, the 15 years of well-managed distances, the way she had specifically, and without trying, found the one gap in a system he had believed was sealed. He was prepared to say all of it. She spoke first. Can I ask you something? Yes. If I had waited, she said. If I'd stayed in the orbit, stayed available, stayed professionally adjacent, made it easy for you to keep finding reasons to be on site, what would you have done? He held her gaze. He knew the answer. He had spent 2 weeks with himself, and he knew the answer with a clarity that was not comfortable. I would have kept finding reasons, he said, and I wouldn't have done anything with them. I would have kept the whole thing at the exact temperature where it was interesting, without being real. She didn't react to this with satisfaction or vindication. She just received it. That's what I thought, she said quietly. Not unkindly, just truthfully. You were protecting yourself, he said. I was being accurate, she corrected, gently but precisely. There's a difference. Protecting myself implies I was afraid. I wasn't afraid. I just know how to read a structure. She looked at him directly. You were maintaining an exit. Every time. Even when you were physically present, even when the conversation got close to something real, there was always an exit held open. I've worked on enough buildings to know the difference between a door that's stuck and a door that someone is actively holding shut. The library was very quiet. He had been seen before. Or he had thought he had been seen by Alina. By his first business partner. By the various people who had moved through his life close enough to form an opinion about him. None of them had said anything as accurate as what Mara had just said. Not because they were less perceptive, but because they had all had investments in a particular version of him. Versions that served their own needs in one way or another. Their seeing had always been bent slightly by what they wanted the seeing to confirm. She had no investment in a particular version of him. She just looked at what was there. What would be different? She said, he waited. That's the question I need you to answer. She said it without ultimatum. Without pressure, in the tone of someone asking because the answer is genuinely the only thing that matters. Not what you understand now. Not what you've realized. Not what you're sorry for. What would actually be different? Because insight isn't architecture. You can understand exactly how a building failed and still rebuild it the same way. The question sat in the air between them. He had prepared for a version of this moment. He had spent 2 weeks thinking and sitting in his own silence and arriving at real things. He had the understanding. He had the honest accounting. He believed the genuine intention. What? He did not have, and what her question was pointing at, with the same steady accuracy, she pointed at secondary moisture blooms and misspecified lime. Compositions was the answer to what different would actually look like in practice, not in principle, not as intention. In practice, in the daily lived architecture of a person who had built himself one specific way for a very long time and was standing in a 19th century library claiming, with apparently genuine feeling, that he was prepared to build differently, he could rebuild. He believed that. He was not certain, and she was asking him to be certain before she gave him anything more, which was he recognized. With a clarity that was equal parts admiration and pain, exactly the right thing to ask. He said, something moved in her expression, not disappointment. Something more complicated. Something that looked, if he was reading it accurately, almost like relief. The specific relief of a person who has been hoping that someone will be honest and has just received honesty. She said it quietly. She said it in the way she said most true things, simply, without drama. Offered to the space between them, without requiring any particular response. And that's the whole problem. She said, the afternoon light fell through the unboarded windows in long, specific rectangles across the original timber floor. Somewhere in the building, the radio played on. The cast-iron gallery held its lines above them. He stood in the library and understood that he had done. Today, something he had not done in 15 years. He had arrived somewhere without an exit held open. He had said true things without knowing how they would land. He had answered a question he couldn't deflect with the only honest answer available, which was insufficient, which he had admitted was insufficient. Which was, in its own inadequate way, a thing he had never done before. It was not enough. Not nearly. But it was, for the first time in a very long time, real, and she was still standing there. He did not call her that weak. This was not the withholding of a man reverting to pattern, not the familiar withdrawal. Not the door held carefully open at the precise temperature of interesting without real. He knew the difference now, from the inside, and the difference was this. The old distance had been effortless. It had required nothing. It was the natural resting state of a system designed to maintain it. This was not effortless. This was the hardest kind of stillness, the kind that required active choice, daily. Against the pull of wanting to reach before he was ready to reach honestly, he had told her he didn't have the answer yet. He had meant it, and so the days that followed were not days of managed distance. There were days of actual work, the interior kind, the unglamorous kind, the kind that produced no visible output and could not be entered into a project file or presented at a board review. The kind that Nathaniel Crane had spent his entire adult life successfully avoiding. He called his father on a Tuesday evening. This was not something he did regularly. Their relationship had the particular texture of two people who shared a significant history and had never fully discussed it. Civil, occasional, operating at the careful distance that families sometimes arrive at when the closer territory is too complicated to navigate without. A map neither party has made, his father answered on the third ring, with the slightly surprised warmth he always had when Nathaniel called unexpectedly, as though each call was a small gift he hadn't been sure would arrive. They talked for an hour and 40 minutes. Nathaniel did not deliver a prepared speech. He did not arrive at a dramatic moment of cathartic disclosure. He asked his father about the delivery route, whether he still drove, which roads he'd been watching lately, and his father talked about them with the same specific, unself-conscious affection he always had, describing a bridge on the Eastern Arterial that had been poorly patched twice in 3 years and would need proper structural attention before another winter, and a stretch of road near the industrial district that had been done right for once, a crew that clearly knew what they were doing. His father talked about the roads as though they mattered, because they did. Halfway through, there was a pause in the conversation, the natural, comfortable kind that appears in long conversations between people who are not performing for each other, and Nathaniel said, "I think I took the wrong thing from watching you when I was a kid." His father was quiet for a moment. "You watched me lose things," his father said. "Yes. And you decided not to have things." "Yes." Another pause. Not uncomfortable. The pause of two people arriving at something that has been present between them for a long time without being named. "I lost things," his father said slowly. "That's true. I also had them first." His voice had the quality of a man who had thought about this privately for a long time and was now being offered the opportunity to say it plainly. "You can't lose what you never had, Nathaniel. But you also can't." He stopped, reconsidered, started again more carefully. "The not losing, it's not the same as the having. I know you know that. I think you've known it for a while." "I'm starting to understand it differently," Nathaniel said. "That's not the same thing as knowing it." "No," he agreed. "It's not." His father asked after a moment whether there was someone. The question was asked with the specific delicacy of a parent who has learned not to press, but cannot entirely conceal the hoping. Nathaniel said he wasn't sure yet, that there might be, that he was trying to figure out how to be a person who deserved to find out. His father said, "That's a better starting place than most people find." He drove to his father's apartment that Sunday for the first time in 2 years, and they had lunch and walked along the Eastern Arterial, and his father pointed out the poorly patched bridge with the proprietary concern of a man who had been monitoring its condition for years. And Nathaniel looked at it, really looked at it, and said, "You're right. That needs proper work." His father looked at him with an expression Nathaniel didn't have a category for, and then looked back at the bridge, and they walked on. He found a therapist on a Wednesday, which was not a dramatic decision and did not feel like one. It felt like the decision to hire a structural engineer when you understood that your own expertise, while genuine, was insufficient for the specific problem in front of you. He went to the first session with the professional directness he brought to initial consultations and told the therapist, without preamble, that he had spent 15 years building emotional unavailability into the foundation of his personality and was trying to understand how to change the underlying structure without collapsing the building. The therapist said that was a useful way to frame it, and that they should probably start at the foundation. He said he had expected that. She said most people did. And most people still found it harder than they expected. She was right. 6 weeks after the library, he went back to the alderman. Not for a project review. not with a manufactured justification. The project was in its final Phase 3 completion stage. Brennan's team had finished the arcade detailing. The Heritage Authority had conducted its penultimate compliance review, and the building was approaching the end of its restoration with the quiet, achieved solidity of something that had been done properly. He went alone on a Saturday morning. With his project manager's site key and no particular schedule, the building was still on a weekend. No contractors, no machinery, no ambient noise of work in progress. Just the building and the November light coming through the restored windows and the smell of lime, an old timber that he had learned to recognize. As the smell of care made material, he walked through the ground floor slowly. Through the restored entrance vestibule, past the original tiled floor that Brennan's team had cleaned and regrouted with a precision that had pleased the Heritage Authority enormously. Through the East Arcade, the detailing complete. The cast plaster moldings replaced were damaged beyond repair and conserved were salvageable. The whole system consistent in a way that required an informed eye to achieve, into the main hall. It was extraordinary still. More extraordinary than it had been on the evening he had stood here with Mara watching the north wall in the failing light. Because it was now more fully itself, the completion of the restoration, revealing the building's original intention in the way that completion always does. The hall was not what it had been in 1923, and was not pretending to be. It was what it had become after a century of use, and a decade of neglect, and 7 months of careful, honest work. It was a building that had been made, as she had said. Honest about what it survived, he stood in the center of the hall. The light fell through the west windows in the particular way of winter morning. Longer shadows, the kind of light that shows surfaces honestly rather than flatteringly. The plasterwork on all 4 walls was visible in it without idealization. You could see, if you looked carefully. The joins where damaged sections had been replaced, not invisible, not disguised, but integrated, present, acknowledged. The repair was part of the building's record now. Not an erasure of what had happened, but an honest account of it. He stood there for a long time. He thought about what she had asked him. What would actually be different? He had been sitting with that question for 6 weeks. Through the conversations with his father and the Sunday walk along the arterial and the weekly sessions with the therapist and the slow, unglamorous, nonlinear process of looking at the foundation of the thing. He had built an understanding it clearly enough to say something true. He had an answer now, not a complete answer. He was honest enough about structures to know that complete answers to foundational questions were a form of wishful thinking. That buildings were maintained over time, not fixed once, but a real answer. Something grounded in actual, changed understanding rather than the performance of changed understanding. Something that would hold weight. He took out his phone. He did not call. He stood in the main hall of the Alderman Civic Hall on a Saturday morning in November, and he looked at what 6 months of honest work had made of a building that had been given up on. And then he did something that Nathaniel Crane had not done in 15 years. He called without knowing exactly what he was going to say, not because he was unprepared, because he had finally understood in the way that certain structural principles become genuinely understood only. When you have made the mistake they guard against, that preparation was not the same as honesty. That having the right words ready was not the same as meaning them. That the exit he had always kept held open had been built most fundamentally. From the ability to know in advance how every conversation would go, he didn't know how this one would go. That was the point. That was, he understood now, the whole point. She answered on the 4th ring. Her voice had the same quality it always had, present, unhurried, unburdened by the social performance of the moment. Not warm as a performance. Warm as a fact about herself. Nathaniel. I'm at the Alderman, he said. A pause. Is everything all right with the building? The building is extraordinary, he said. He looked at the north wall, at the repaired plasterwork, at the joins that were present and acknowledged and integrated. It's honest. It's the most honest building I've ever worked on. She was quiet for a moment. I have an answer, he said, to what you asked me. Not a complete one, I want to be honest about that, but a real one. Something I've actually worked on rather than thought my way around. He paused. I'm not standing here with an exit held open. I want you to know that. I don't have a recovery position prepared. I don't know how this conversation ends. The hall was very still. That's different, she said quietly. Yes, tell me the answer, she said, and so he did. Standing in the center of the restored main hall, in the winter morning light that showed everything honestly, he told her what would be different, not in the language of grand intention, but in the specific. Grounded language of a man who had looked at his own foundation and understood what needed to change and had begun. Slowly and imperfectly, and with the help of people he had finally allowed to assist him. To change it, he told her about his father and the bridge on the Eastern Arterial. He told her about the therapist and the foundation and the way she had been right that it was harder than he had expected. He told her that he understood now that the distances he had kept had not been strength, that he had been mistaking the absence of loss for the presence of something worth having, which was the structural error of his entire adult life. He told her that he did not know what came next. He told her that not knowing was, for him, genuinely new. She listened. She listened the way she always listened, fully, without the restlessness of someone waiting for their turn, without the performance of attention. Actually listening. When he finished, there was a silence that had the quality of the hall itself, not empty, not full of anything predetermined. Just open, the kind of space in which something real could be built. If the materials were sound and the work was done honestly, and no one tried to rush the curing, there's a section of the library gallery, she said finally, that I can't figure out. The original ironwork specification. The foundry records are incomplete, and I've been looking at 3 different possibilities for 2 weeks, and I can't find the right question to ask. He understood what she was offering. Not resolution. Not a cleared path or a guaranteed outcome. An invitation into real work offered in the only language she had ever used with him, the direct, unburdened language of someone who believed that showing up honestly for a hard problem was worth more than any amount of elegant certainty. Tell me what you have so far, he said, and she did. Outside the alderman's restored windows, the city went about its Saturday business, the infrastructure of ordinary life operating, maintaining, moving in its continuous rhythm. The construction cranes on the distant skyline rotated slowly. The river ran beneath the bridge his father had been watching for 3 years. Inside, the light moved across the honest walls. A man stood in the center of a restored hall and listened fully. Without the exit held open, and it was not comfortable, and it was not certain. It was not anything he could have predicted. It was, for the first time in 15 years, real. That was enough to begin with. That was, in the end, the only thing that ever was.
Please take a moment to like this video. It tells us that stories like this one matter to you, and it helps more people find their way here to this quiet space where real human stories live. Subscribe to True Heart-Touching Stories so you never miss a story that was made to remind you of what matters. Every story we tell is for the person who needs to feel less alone in what they carry. That person might be you today. It might be someone you share this with. Either way, we are glad you are here.